My name's Brian Cam, and I am streaming live to you from London. I am have rotated towards the window so that I can actually be seen more easily. It's quite hot here, but very dark. And I thought for this particular installment, I might not need any notes. I'm probably going to immediately find that I do need notes, and I'm going to say things that I wish I could look up, and then I'm going to wish that I were facing my computer, and this will all be a horrible embarrassment. But in fact, I am going to just try riffing for today and see how it goes. I spoke to a friend recently, and he's just released a podcast. The podcast is called MetaLearn, if you want to look it up. And he's talking about creativity. And in particular, the question is creative output in this day and age, whenever we live now, or let's say in the past decade or two, I think he's kind of referencing, is creative output getting worse on average from what it was, let's say, if 3, 4, 5, 10 decades ago? And he said in arts, music, etc. So I think I will give a little background on what small areas I know and what I think about those areas and how I came to those conclusions. So my background is actually in 18th century literature. Actually, it's my undergraduate I did in Victorian literature, so 19th century stuff, as well as in Russian literature, which I persuaded my university to allow me to study, even though I don't speak Russian. So I did that in translation. I was mainly working on Tolstoy and Thackeray. So that was Vanity Fair and War and Peace. And then I've also got a degree, a master's in 18th century and Romantic studies in English literature as well. So that's kind of the Romantic poets, but I was also working on the 18th century novel in English. So I have a little bit of background in literature. I have no formal background in film, although I did take some film courses at uni that were amazing. One was about the music of film, and one was about one was just on Hitchcock and Bergman, actually. Ingmar Bergman is still one of my favorite directors, and it was largely as a result of that very detailed class where we read a lot of it. So I would say that's, decades ago, but it's still a thing, which is that I did study literature and I have been interested in film for a very long time. The film thing is kind of funny. I was just one of those annoying teenagers. Like, it's not that I didn't like all the films that my parents introduced us to. Like, I was very into Star Wars, for example, that my dad was into. And yesterday I did a live stream with Achim, which you can find on this YouTube channel if you're watching on YouTube, about spaced repetition. And we were just trying to figure out, how do you remember the years that films came out in? And the film that came up was Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And that's another film that I remember watching a lot with my family. In fact, I think we had it on Laserdisc and like one of these old style projectors that were like, you probably won't remember these if you now have like these amazingly tiny projectors that are all HD and amazing. These were like big old things. They made a lot of noise. They were like air cooled, and they played. Had like a kind of big setup to do it. And they weren't very good, and they were very loud. And laser discs are funny because I can't remember exactly how long they store, but it's not a movie length. I think it's like 45 minutes. So if the movie's long enough, you might have like 3 of these, which I actually think isn't 45 minutes the length of an old style film reel as well. So maybe there was some thinking to that. But of course, with a film reel, you have like a literal guy whose job it is to change it at the right time so that no one notices this thing. Whereas on a Laserdisc, you've actually like physically got to like flip it like like a record, basically. So, you know, I kind of grew up with standard, what I think of as like standard American action films, Disney films, and things like that. My parents are very much not classic or foreign or indie film watchers. Not that they wouldn't watch it if you kind of dragged them into it, which by the time of my late teens I was starting to do. But that was not their natural inclination, was to watch obscure films. They mainly watched the kind of popular things, and I did too as a result. And as I said, I became an increasingly obnoxious teenager. I started seeking out kind of edgier Hollywood films, indie films, you know, like I can remember Memento and Requiem for a Dream and films like that. Some of these Aronofsky films, Pi, which I actually have no idea how those were produced or much about them, but I do remember seeking them out, and they were a little outside the mainstream. It wasn't the case that I was thinking this morning, like maybe I was watching I was largely watching them on my own. So even if people at my high school, like a few other weird film nerd types, were also watching these, we mainly like talked about them and then watched them separately, I think. So I kind of didn't have much of a community around that. And in my late teens, my father gave me this book, which I still recommend actually to anyone who's interested in this kind of thing. And that is I think I've actually got 2 copies of it here. 1001 Films to See Before You Die. Yeah, the 1001 Films to See Before You Die. I think, oh yeah, here I can see. So this is the actual one that he gave me, which you can see has mostly no cover. And I think it's from 2003, so I guess I would have been 19 when that came out. And it's just like, what I like about it is it's just like a list of extremely positive reviews of movies. Like there's nothing in there where they're like, well, it's kind of good, but you know, you can just, you know, like there's no mixed reviews. It's just the kind of reviews, and they're written by dozens of different film critics and things like that, where they just say, I love this film or something like that, and here's why. And so it's very like motivational. And so I set out on the weird, mostly solo task of trying to watch these. I mean, 1001 Films is a lot of films. If you think about it, if you watched one a day, then it would take like 3 years, I guess. If you want, and that's actually quite hard to do because not all of these films are easy to find, actually. If you watch one a week, which I think is more typical, like that's sustainable but high if you're talking about, I mean, obviously you just saw that one of them is Indiana Jones. So they're not all difficult art films, but there's like enough in there that you would be like, okay, am I really going to watch another really, really depressing, long, you know, whatever. I mean, like, so for example, Shoah, which is a 10 or 11, no, I don't want to exaggerate. Maybe it's not, maybe it's a 9-hour documentary, not just on the Holocaust, but specifically on the death camps, is a film in this book. So, you know, like 1 week you'll have to watch that 9-hour film or whatever. Maybe it's 10 hours. I don't know. It is fantastic, by the way, if you do manage to see it. But so as of today, I should have looked this up before I started recording, but I have seen about 750, let's say. It might be a little more, maybe a little less. And so about 3/4 of these, and it took me, I guess, like 18 years, let's say. So I've seen a lot of films. And the question, to come back to it, this is not just about me waffling on about my own life, but it's just giving maybe a little bit of background into what cultural qualifications I have, if any. Those are the formal ones. I've run a book club in London for 10 years, and I just read a lot, I think it's fair to say, and in many genres as well. But the question is art getting worse? Now, I'm going to probably just answer it in both ways and say possibly no and possibly yes. And the possibly no is going to come from a way that I think that it relates to cultural evolution and the way that I think that culture is originally generated. So let's say, sort of lost my train of thought. There's a new form of cultural evolution that's coming back in that's to do with more with variation and selection. So basically, the question is, does human culture progress along Darwinian lines? And if so, what are the kind of dynamics of it? And as you may be aware, this was the question right from the start with Darwin. And it led to things like Herbert Spencer and people who were pretty, what's now called social Darwinism, which is basically there's a kind of extreme competition, fight to the death, Darwinian battle over, let's say between races or between cultures or between, within cultures or something like that. And then the best is somehow selected out of this. Now, that view, which is also like very compatible with certain ideas about how the market works, is a little bit, it's not a little bit problematic, it's deeply problematic. But at the same time, there's been, in the past few decades, new views about cultural evolution that are starting to come back. And of course, they have to kind of grapple with their past in terms of how do we introduce Darwinian thinking into the arts without going into this social Darwinist mode where we say that whatever exists, I call this in my mind the teleological trap, which is basically saying, well, if you take Darwinian thinking, then whatever we observe to exist must be the best thing because it exists, and therefore it won, and therefore what won was the best. And because we assume that what won was the best, then this is the best of all possible worlds. And that is it's an easy trap to fall into, but I don't think it's well supported in Darwin. And I also think it's really, really problematic when you start not talking about, let's say, we can be a little bit cooler about saying, well, this species of whatever, dinosaur or bird or whatever went extinct than we can with this, culture or cultural or genre or whatever, or culture itself, race, right? Whatever. Race is itself this extremely problematic term that doesn't really exist. But in the 19th century, they for sure thought it existed. And I guess, since these are concepts used by humans, if many people act like it exists, then in a certain sense, it kind of does. But that's getting very far afield from the question. The question is culture getting worse, or is creative output getting worse? And the reason I bring up this issue of variation and selection is I kind of have this view that the alternative would be that art is done by design. And of course, individual creatives may have their own designs. They may try things out. You may even try to get institutions which try to produce art. But in general, I think it's fair to say that there's an element of trial and error in art. And so that in a sense, it's bottom up, which is not that, it may be that the top down kind of planning is a necessary but not sufficient condition. So maybe if you're going to write the next best American record, or the next, great American novel or whatever it is, then you have to believe that you're capable of that. But obviously that's not sufficient to actually do it. So it may be that you know what I mean? Like it can't be the case that just simply planning an art project leads to its unproblematic delivery. So then it must be a lot of people kind of trying trial and error. And then you end up with this selection effect. So this is one of the first reasons that I think it might often appear in any given time that things are getting worse when in fact they're not. So what I'm saying is that even though I do think that the output of Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s is dramatically better than anything I see coming out of studios in the past 2 decades, let's say. It's hard to say that, you know, percentage what, like what would it mean for Hollywood to be worse than it was then? And how do you mean worse? So in terms of sales, sales have just gone up and up and up. So there's that, if that's the metric, then, you know, you can't really say it's gotten worse. If the metric is something to do with the awards, well, the awards, you know, are kind of part of the system and can't easily be disambiguated. And it's not like now we have 10 Oscars or 10 Palme d'Ors, whereas before we had one. There's still just one. The question, I guess, would be, is the quality of each of those ones worse than it was several decades ago? Again, a hard problem, and one, I think probably I would say yes, they are getting worse. At the same time, I would also say these prizes have always been political, contentious. Often what I think is the best film doesn't win in any given year. There's some really famous kind of instances of that. But one other thing is that, and this is one of those facts that I wish I had looked up before, but I didn't. I read a film theory textbook, which was like one of the only books that I've really read about the study of film. And if you're interested, just say so in the chat. I'm not looking at the chat right now, but I will look at it at the end and try and take any questions there that may have come up. And one thing that book says is that the studio system in the 30s and 40s was the output was just dramatically higher. Films were much cheaper to make, and people made a lot more of them. Many of those are not preserved. So what may be going on is that we were making 10 or even 100, maybe, I don't think it's 1,000 times more films from the studios, but I think it might be like on not just tens of times more, but hundreds of times more that the studios were putting out. And some of these films were just, you know, like we have a few that have persisted that are very, very good films that were famously made very quickly and very cheaply. One is the kind of prime example of this is a film called Detour from 1944, I want to say. Again, can't look it up. But that film was, the reputation, and I may get the figures wrong, is that it was made in 6 days for $6,000. And it's a great film. It's not long. I think it's like 81 minutes long or something. It's like under feature length, which is, I think it is these 45-minute reels, and feature length is at least 2 of those reels. And then another common film length is 2 hours 15 if you get that third reel. And so it's a thing that for many years, I didn't know that actually they're kind of like standard lengths to films, and they can be tweaked a little bit, but not like all that much. These days, I'm sure it doesn't matter at all because it's all probably digital, or maybe still people are using films and changing reels. I actually don't know. I'm not on that side of film. But one possibility is that there's just hundreds or thousands of times more films being made in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And that this starts to change as things get more expensive. I guess unions come about, but also I don't want to blame unions. The other thing that's happening now is just venture capital. So on the kind of opposite side from if it's getting harder to make, it may be that things are getting more regulated and therefore harder to make. And if they're getting more regulated, then you start to sound like a libertarian or something like that, saying, oh, if there were only less regulation, then more films would be made. I don't really necessarily subscribe to that. And you could maybe make I don't know if it's an opposite critique, but if you could also make this kind of critique that capital itself has kind of ruined films, in the sense that they're much bigger budget, these films, right? And they employ just thousands of people. Any major Hollywood blockbuster today will employ tons and tons and tons of people at every level. And so they are funded often by some kind of venture capital. I don't know the ins and outs of that, but basically, once you've got big corporate money going into a film, it can't lose money. So you essentially can't take risks. And this is something that's changed since like the 70s. Like, if you think about it, if you know a bit about film, try to name films that have sequels from before Jaws, let's say 1975. There are some where it's kind of like a string of related films. I can think of Dr. Mabuse, or wasn't there like, was it Ivan the Terrible? But that's a Soviet film, so it's not really necessarily the same thing that's going on. Like, I'm not saying there are none. There probably are, excuse me, films that do have sequels from before this time, but really a lot changed with Jaws. And what changed with Jaws is nationwide release. So basically, the way films used to work, and now that I'm thinking this through, I think I do have a view that this system was better. So basically, sorry. So basically, you had studios making much more films, like a far larger number of films. You had a lot more experimentation. As I mentioned the other night to my friend, for example, there's the famous case of Orson Welles, who comes into RKO, and he has never made any film, as far as I know. I think that's the lore. And he asks for, essentially upfront budget to make 2 films. And the 2 films he makes are Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons. And I, just to be sacrilegious, might prefer Magnificent Ambersons to Citizen Kane. So if you haven't seen it, can highly recommend it. But the point is, like, if you just come in with enough confidence and you seem like a interesting guy, you could just make a film in those days. And I say interesting guy, yes, it was very male, although there were major female directors in the 40s and 50s. It's always like a smaller number. But there was like a kind of period in the 40s. My overall sense is that for women, there was like a kind of period in the 40s, 50s where it was maybe slightly easier, or maybe I'm only thinking of Ida Lupino. And then it kind of got worse in the 70s, 80s, and then maybe now it's gotten a little bit better, but it's still terrible. It's still extremely, not terrible, but it's just very, very male dominated for whatever reason. I don't have any like knowledge of that side of things necessarily, but it was more like the Wild West, let's just say. And like, in terms of getting funding, you have an idea for a film. Nobody cares who you are. They don't care what your connections are. They don't care what your, and that's the same way that actors were discovered, right? Like there's like, there's lots of famous stories about these very random ways that people are just discovered on boats. I want to say, like, it's one of those Swedes. It's not, I don't think it's Garbo. I don't think it's Greta Garbo. Is it Ingrid Bergman? I don't know. But there are all these old stories about, just like random people being funded in the arts. The other thing is this nationwide release. So basically, with Jaws, it kind of maybe starts with Psycho, actually. So the way that, I better just explain how it used to work. So from the start of film, whatever, very start of the 20th century, until, let's say, Psycho, and there is this kind of star system that emerges and stuff, but let's just focus on how distribution worked. You would make a film, a studio would make a film, and like I said, they made lots of films, like tons and tons and tons, in the silent era and in the early talkie era, and even in the 40s and 50s, they were just making far, far, far more films. and they would open in specific cities, like in specific, and I don't know, like I just know that fact. I don't actually know exactly how it worked. I think they opened in LA and New York, let's say, or they opened in, yeah, maybe they randomized it a bit more. But basically the way it would work was that a film would, if it did well, then there would be a release at other cities. So there was this kind of rolling release process whereby films that brought in audiences that people seemed to like were selected, right? So you can see why I'm relating this to Darwin, because you've got more variation because you've got more films being made, and you've got this selection process, which is like, what do people seem to want to see? What does well? And so the end result is the Hollywood golden age, basically. And I know this whole golden era thing is like controversial, but yeah, there are a lot of insanely amazing films from that period. And so how does this change? Psycho is one of them. Hitchcock, not known for his sort of humility, shall we say. I actually don't know a huge amount about him as a person, but I think he was not the funnest person to work with. He is not alone in that. Of course, there's really famous other cases of nightmare directors and actors and all the other stuff, and I won't go into those. I mean, Kubrick is another famous case. There's actually a lot. Probably it's more unusual for a director to be like a well-balanced, chill, and understanding individual than it is for him to be, a kind of egomaniac or something. And I'm not saying that in any disparaging way. I'm just saying, yeah. So Hitchcock basically wants, and Psycho, I've got to guess these dates. I think it's 1959. I could be wrong. Psycho comes out, it's doing this nationwide. It's doing this not nationwide release thing, I should say. It's doing this rollout. And Hitchcock, because he's so influential and so respected, is basically like contacting all these local newspapers, basically to say, look, you can't spoil Psycho. I will try not to spoil Psycho. If you haven't seen Psycho, let's just say it's almost two films in one film. There's another film actually that came out almost the same year, La Ventura, Michelangelo Antonioni. In many ways, it's like the opposite of Psycho, because Psycho is a fairly mainstream, it's a huge success. It's very memorable, intense. I mean, it's famous for a reason. And if you haven't seen it, I won't say any more about it than that. La Ventura is similarly, what's similar is the structure, because basically in both films, you think you're going to get one thing and you totally do not. And so I won't spoil La Ventura either, although it's much harder to spoil because it's very slow and it's very arty and it's very like, what is actually going on in this film? I started to kind of say, oh yeah, I was this obnoxious teenager and at a certain point began subjecting my family to these films. And I can remember watching La Ventura with my mother, and her, like, she sat it out because it's like 3 hours long. And at the end, her being like, oh my God, that is the worst film I've ever seen. And that was not the last time that someone in my family like watched a film with me. My brother watched Naked Lunch with me. My sister watched something. Oh, she watched La Dolce Vita when she was like, I don't know, like 12 or something like that. And in each case, they were like, oh my God, why do you watch these films? My brother was also, I mean, I don't know that I'm still probably not old enough to watch Naked Lunch, but yeah. Anyway, so the point is that Hitchcock began to kind of like a little bit interfere with this natural, it's not natural, right? All of this is kind of made up industry stuff. But the older form of releasing a film, which is basically it just goes to wherever, and if people seem to like it in those places, then it just carries on. And Hitchcock is like, no, I don't want this to be reviewed by the local paper. So he gets all involved in like both creating suspense, because I don't think, I could be wrong about trailers. Like, you do occasionally see trailers from like the 50s and stuff, and maybe there were trailers going way back, but there weren't like a lot of commercials and stuff like that. I think, and Hitchcock really pushed those for Psycho, and he also really interfered with the kind of review process where basically he didn't want it to be spoiled. Now, what happens with Jaws, and again, it's between 70 and 75. I kind of think it's 75. Is that the idea by that point is like, okay, I have no idea if it's actually originally inspired by Hitchcock, or whether Psycho is the kind of move in this direction and just continues with Jaws or not. But with Jaws comes this nationwide release thing where basically they really build it up. And so now they're basically really promoting it everywhere because it's going to open everywhere in the nation on the same day. And now that happens internationally. So there's an international release day. You can maybe already start to sense what the problem with this is, which is that you kind of have to know in advance that your film is going to be good and it's going to be a big seller in order to put that much funding into the marketing. And because, of course, the studios are making fewer films, they're taking more funding from capitalists. And the capitalists, if there's one thing capitalists like, it's return on investment, right? So you basically got these vast sums of money coming in. You've got international release dates where it has to be a success. It literally has to, because it's, so much money of other people's money. This is the other thing, is that the studios largely like built themselves. They were in the black the whole time, but this changes by the 60s and 70s. And I'm not a film historian, so I'm just like ad-libbing here. But the studios were insanely wealthy in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Like, you can already see even how wealthy the actors are in films like Sunset Boulevard, where these silent actors are just like wealthy beyond imagination. And of course, that's probably also true of Hollywood A-listers today. But there was just much more of that. Like to be a major director in those days was like crazy, because they were these kind of intense evolutionary machines that generated good films, and good was the metric, was the market, right? Which is, do people go and see it? But I suppose there's like a kind of interesting tension there, because that's still the market today, right? Like, you make a big film and then you try to get people to watch it. And what's the difference? The difference is that the selection process is being done earlier, right? Which is that if you've got to decide up front, is this movie going to make money or not? Is this going to be a good movie in those purely monetary terms? You have to know a lot about your audience. You have to know a lot about what they've seen previously. And the end result, as I kind of alluded to before, is a lot of sequels, because if someone's seen an earlier, basically this exact same film before, they're more likely to see the same thing again. And so you can kind of just keep producing the same thing. You've switched from this explore mode to like an exploit mode. But the other thing is that, and I'm not defending the dynamics of this, because I think, first of all, don't glamorize the studio system in the 30s and 40s. The misbehavior and the broken lives. The number of people that just flat out died. There are many, many famous ones that you will know. Marilyn Monroe and Judy Garland are among the most famous sort of cases of this, and I'm probably not even thinking of even more famous ones. But this studio system did chew you up and spit you out. It did not care about you. And even when you see these film, there, is it like The Bad and the Beautiful or something? There's like I can't remember if that's the right film or not. There are films in like the 50s and 60s that do kind of show the cost of these star systems, of this star system. And Casting Couch is another one. The just like, I mean, there's like Fatty Arbuckle. There's all kinds of like really terrible stuff going on. So it may be a golden age, but that doesn't mean that it's like a fun time to be a creative. Yes, certain unknown creatives like just hit it out of the park, and maybe it's much easier to get funded if you're unknown and if you're not well connected. I think that's certainly true. At the same time, you know, you've got Barry Moore's at that time, and you've got Redgraves and whatever, and they probably, you know, go back to this theater tradition. I don't know. I'm just like thinking aloud here. But there something definitely changed in film. I'm not sure if I'm going to answer literature today. I also don't have my screen on, so I don't even really know if this is like recording properly. But hopefully it is. I guess I'll try and like synthesize what I've said about film, and then maybe tomorrow I'll come back to literature. With film, I think a lot of good films were made because of the material abundance of the studio systems and their willingness to take risks, basically. So that selecting for risk-taking people has all kinds of human costs that we may not like appreciate at the time, in the sense that, like, you know, it's already kind of evident what I'm saying is that alcoholism and addiction were rampant. That's probably true still in Hollywood. I'm not saying that, oh yeah, now Hollywood is much better because it selects for more stable people or something like that. But just as in war or venture capital or certain areas of finance or whatever, like, it's not always a great idea to select for the maximally risk-taking people. And yet it does produce something, right? Like, I mean, it's like, this is why I'm like very hesitant to kind of make prescriptions about how, you know, is creative stuff worse? Is it better? You know, should it be like this? Should it be like that? Like, I do think that if you get more creative freedom, you will get more creative freedom from a kind of centralization of wealth and just a material abundance where you just say, yeah, let's try it. I mean, you could say the Catholic Church is doing this in the Renaissance, and I'm sure that's wrong in the details in all sorts of ways. But let's just say if you'll fund anyone and you're willing to like have 95% of those fail, you're going to end up probably producing a greater number of creative successes, I think, that are kind of like orders of magnitude better than anything else, in part because creative endeavors always require risk on behalf of the creator. Whether that risk needs to be tethered to a kind of financial, like, true risk, in the sense of like, when I say true risk, what do I mean? Like, does your creative risk have to be tied to your material risk taking? Like, there might be periods of society where that's just not the case, right? Like, which is that, I'm just going to do a thought experiment here, and I know that these are all very problematic. The fact that essentially Western people are always doing these thought experiments and making shit up about other cultures or whatever. But you might imagine, let's just not even pretend that this is on Earth. You might imagine a society where prophets or shamans or whatever, like, even if they're not very good at their job, like, once you've chosen that path, the society is just like, well, yeah, that's that's something that we just support, basically. I mean, to be honest, like, the priesthood was kind of like that for a very long time. Maybe it's not so much anymore, right? Which is that voluntarily people are like, okay, the thing we do is like tithe to the church, and the church just pays these guys, and some of them are good, you know, some of them are good at being priests. Other ones produce Benedictine and chartreuse, like alcohol. Other ones make olive oil or something. I don't know I feel like if you go into sort of Southern Europe, there's a lot of things that these priests make. I know they went into bookbinding at a certain period in history when that was a new thing. I think in like the 800s or something. They do all kinds of things. And then you also get ones that are just like weird philosopher types that are like, I'm gonna, you know, tons of these guys are just doing transcription. You know, there's this kind of naive idea that the church is opposed to, the classics, and it wants to get rid of these ancient Greeks that were more scientific or something like that. That turns out to be not really true, as far as I know, which is that they did their like absolute best to preserve everything they could. But if you're literally writing on animal skin, like vellum, or like really early paper, that stuff degrades. It degrades every couple generations. I don't know if you've got very old, like books that are 100 years old, but you probably don't have books that are 200 years old. If you do, you probably know that you have those. And they've probably been very, very carefully looked after. And over 500 years or something, even if they're very carefully looked after, that tends to require centralization and in a place that could burn down or something like that. So where am I going with this? One thing I might say is that, yeah, if you can decouple creative risk-taking from material survival needs, that might just in itself produce better creativity. And if you have a higher tolerance for, let's say, bad creatives, I mean, it's my view that you can't really know upfront until someone's actually like really tried for a long period at something to know whether they are ever going to be a master worker in a subject. I mean, like, yes, there are people that, Mozart, Rambo, like people who are just these child prodigies, and you kind of know that, well, it seems like this guy's going to be a composer or a poet or whatever it is. At the same time, when you look at novelists, they start much later in general. And it may be that they just require decades of reading in order to get that good. And if you can't support those decades of reading, the artistic output will drop off. So that's one way that it might be getting worse. Actually, there are a few directions that I want to go from here. One is the algorithmic stuff, like the Netflix. I do want to talk about Netflix. And I do want to talk about literature. And I do want to talk about, there's probably other aspects of culture that I could think about talking about too. Okay, but on that note, I am going to stop this stream. It's kind of annoying not being in front of my computer, but that's okay.